I'd never date him now. And he walked out on me. My husband overheard me tell my sister I'd never date him now, so he got up and left me. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to everyone on Mr. Peter Stories today. I'm feeling a bit upset because I see many of you watching my stories but not subscribing to the channel. Why? If you lose me or forget about me, how will you ever find me again? I have an emotional connection with each of you, and that's why I'm asking for your support. Please subscribe to this channel. You are more than just subscribers to me. You are my family. I'm upset with you because I care so much, and I want to continue sharing my stories with all of you. If I've ever hurt you in any way, I'm truly sorry. I care about each of you deeply. If you enjoy my stories, please let me know by writing yes in the comments. Thank you for being here with me. I appreciate all of you. Now let's dive into today's story. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. The San Antonio summer air hung thick with jasmine and mountain laurel, their sweet perfume drifting through the open windows of the luxury penthouse in the city's prestigious Dominion district. Dakota Juniper stood in her pristine kitchen, where imported Carrara marble countertops gleamed under artisanal blown-glass pendant lights. Her perfectly manicured fingers, adorned only by a platinum wedding band and a 3-carat cushion-cut diamond engagement ring, traced absent patterns on the rim of her crystal wine glass. A 5th anniversary gift from the man whose name now caught in her throat. Earlier that morning she had watched Maverick leave for work, his Tom Ford suit impeccably pressed, his leather briefcase swinging with the same metronomic precision she'd observed for the past 3 years. The same routine, the same quick peck on her cheek, the same practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. She remembered a time when his goodbye kisses had left her breathless, when his eyes had sparkled with possibilities and plans. Their open-concept living space stretched before her like a museum of their shared dreams, each piece of modernist furniture carefully selected during weekend trips to designer showrooms, when she and Maverick would spend hours planning their future. The Minotti sectional, where they once curled up together, sketching floor plans for their dream home. The custom-built entertainment center that had sparked their first major argument as a married couple, and their first passionate reconciliation. Now these same pieces stood as silent witnesses to the unraveling of those dreams, each perfectly arranged item a testament to the life they'd crafted together. A life that, despite its material perfection, had begun to feel as hollow as the carefully curated vases that lined their floating shelves. Dakota lifted the wineglass to her lips, letting the rich Cabernet coat her tongue as she pressed her phone closer to her ear. Her sister Valeria had always been her confidant, the keeper of her deepest fears and darkest thoughts. Today, those thoughts had taken on a particularly bitter taste. Val, if I met him now, knowing what I know... Dakota's voice carried notes of disappointment and something darker, more dangerous. She paused, swirling the wine in her glass, watching it catch the late afternoon light. I wouldn't even give him a second glance. That spark he had when we met at the startup conference, that raw ambition that made everyone in the room gravitate toward him. It's gone. The setting sun painted their floor-to-ceiling windows in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across Brazilian cherry hardwood floors. Through the windows, the San Antonio skyline stretched out before her, a glittering promise of possibility that seemed to mock the stagnation she felt in her own life. Remember how he used to be? Dakota continued, moving from the kitchen to the living room, her bare feet silent against the cool floors. God, Val, he was magnetic. Everyone at that conference knew he was going to be somebody. The way he commanded attention when he pitched his ideas. Remember how he had the venture capitalists eating out of his hand? She stopped at the windows, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Below, the city pulsed with life, with ambition, with all the dreams she feared they'd left behind. Now, She let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the empty space. Now he's just comfortable. Another faceless suit at Goldman Sachs, pushing papers and playing it safe. Remember how he used to talk about revolutionizing investment banking in Texas, the fire in those storm-grey eyes when he'd sketch out plans for his own firm on napkins at Rosella Coffee? A family of birds took flight from their rooftop garden, startling Dakota with their sudden movement. She watched them soar away, feeling an inexplicable pang of envy at their freedom. The worst part is, I think he's happy with it, Val. Happy with being mediocre. Happy with our perfect little life in our perfect little bubble. And She drew in a shaky breath, voicing for the first time the fear that had been growing in her heart. I'm suffocating. The soft sound of a key turning in the front door lock barely registered through her emotional confession. Dakota continued, her voice rising with frustration. If someone had told me 8 years ago that Maverick Gideon would become just another corporate drone, I would have laughed in their face. But here we are, and I'm married to a man who's become a stranger. A man who's lost every ounce of fire that made me fall in love with him. The sudden clatter of keys against hardwood shattered the evening quiet like a gunshot. Dakota spun around, her heart freezing in her chest as she met her husband's gaze. Maverick stood in the foyer, his custom suit jacket draped over one arm, his normally confident posture rigid with shock. 8 years of marriage crystallized into this single devastating moment. The distinction between the man she'd married and the one before her had never been more stark, his once passionate eyes now clouded with betrayal. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken accusations and shattered trust. The Riedel wineglass slipped from Dakota's trembling fingers, falling in what seemed like slow motion before exploding against the Italian tile floor. The sound echoed through the space, but neither of them flinched. They remained frozen, locked in a moment that would divide their lives into before and after. The spilled wine spread across the floor like blood, seeping into the grout between tiles, staining everything it touched, much like the words that now hung in the air between them, impossible to retract. Maverick's leather briefcase slid from his grip, landing with a hollow thud that seemed to echo the emptiness growing between them. His face, usually a mask of careful control, transformed through a cascade of emotions. Shock, hurt, anger, and finally something harder, colder. A look Dakota had never seen before. It was the birth of something dangerous, though she wouldn't understand that until much later. Val, Dakota whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. I'll call you back. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor beside the spreading pool of wine. Maverick, she breathed, his name a prayer and a plea. But the man who had left for work that morning, the comfortable, predictable husband she'd just been lamenting, was already gone. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone whose eyes held not just hurt, but the kindling of an inferno. Chapter 2. Pride Before the Fall. The weeks following Dakota's overheard confession transformed their luxury penthouse into an Arctic wasteland, where even the warmth of the Texas sun seemed to die at their windows. The carefully curated space that had once showcased their success now felt like a mausoleum of their marriage, each designer piece a tombstone marking the death of another shared dream. Maverick moved through their home like a ghost, his presence marked only by the soft glow of his laptop screen in the early hours of morning. The master bedroom remained untouched. He'd taken to sleeping in his home office, surrounded by financial reports and market analyses that served as both shield and sword against the pain of betrayal. The first week, Dakota had tried to bridge the growing chasm between them. She'd left coffee by his office door each morning, prepared exactly as he liked it. 1 raw sugar, a splash of heavy cream. Each cup grew cold, untouched, a daily reminder of the walls he'd erected around himself. She'd written notes, slipped them under his door. Can we talk? I'm sorry. Please." Each one met with silence, more devastating than any shouted accusation. By the second week, the silence had taken on a life of its own, becoming a third presence in their home. It followed Dakota from room to room, whispering accusations in her ear. She found herself talking out loud just to break its hold, her voice sounding foreign and wrong in the emptiness of their space. In his office, Maverick's transformation was taking shape. The comfortable corporate drone Dakota had described was being systematically dismantled, replaced by something harder, more driven. His laptop screen cast a blue glow across his features as he worked through the night, the harsh light emphasizing the new lines of determination etched around his mouth. He began making calls at odd hours, speaking in low, intense tones that carried through the penthouse walls. Names Dakota didn't recognize became regular parts of his vocabulary. Venture capitalists, angel investors, former colleagues who'd struck out on their own. Each conversation seemed to fuel something in him, stoking the embers of ambition into a blaze that would soon consume everything in its path. 3 weeks after that fateful evening, Dakota woke to find Maverick in their kitchen for the first time since the incident. He stood at the marble island, impeccably dressed in a black Tom Ford suit she'd never seen before. His presence commanding in a way that made her breath catch. "Maverick," she started, her voice rough with sleep and hope. "You're here." He didn't turn to face her, but his shoulders tensed at the sound of her voice. "Not for long." His tone was clipped, professional, the voice he used for difficult client calls. "I've submitted my resignation to Goldman Sachs." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Dakota moved further into the kitchen, her bare feet silent against the cool tile. "What? But your position, the partnership track." "The position that made me comfortable?" His laugh was sharp enough to cut. "The partnership that turned me into a corporate drone?" Now he did turn, and the look in his eyes made her take a step back. The comfortable man she'd dismissed was gone, replaced by someone who radiated dangerous intensity. "You were right about one thing, Dakota. I had lost my fire, but you've given it back to me." He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the counter between them. The sound of paper sliding across marble seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "What is this?" Dakota asked, though something in her already knew. "Divorce papers," Maverick replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "I've also liquidated our joint accounts. Your portion has been transferred to a separate account. The details are included in the envelope. The penthouse is yours. I won't be needing it." Dakota's hand trembled as she reached for the envelope. "You're leaving? Just like that? 8 years of marriage, and you don't even want to try? He cut her off, and for the first time real emotion cracked through his composed facade. "I heard every word you said that night, Dakota. Every single word. About how you wouldn't give me a second glance now. About how disappointed you are in what I've become." His hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white with restraint. "Well, congratulations. You've woken up the man you married. Now you get to watch him walk away." He moved past her toward the door, his cologne, different, sharper than his usual scent, lingering in his wake. Dakota turned, the envelope crushed in her grip. "Where will you go?" Maverick paused at the door, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or longing. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, replaced by that new dangerous resolve. "You wanted fire." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a single key, the key to their penthouse, placing it on the entry table with deliberate care. "I'm going to build an inferno." The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty space. Dakota stood frozen, the envelope containing the end of her marriage clutched in her trembling hands as the first rays of morning sun began to paint the walls gold. The light caught the key he'd left behind, making it gleam like a challenge. In the weeks that followed, Maverick's absence became a tangible thing, filling every corner of the penthouse with memories and regrets. Dakota found herself sleeping on his side of their bed, seeking some lingering trace of the man she'd loved, the man she still loved, though she'd realized it too late. The financial district buzzed with whispers of his departure from Goldman Sachs. Rumors spread like wildfire through the tight-knit banking community. Maverick Gideon was calling in favors, leveraging connections, building something in the shadows. Former colleagues reported receiving late-night calls, intense meetings in private clubs where he laid out his vision for a new kind of investment firm. Dakota tracked his movements through these whispers, each new piece of information both a comfort and a torment. The man she'd accused of losing his fire was now burning bright enough to be seen across the city, and she was left to watch from the sidelines as he rose from the ashes of their marriage. 1 month after his departure, she found a note slipped under her door. The paper was expensive, heavy stock, and she recognized his bold handwriting immediately. "Watch me burn it all down and build it back up. You wanted fire? I'll give you an inferno." The note trembled in her hands as she sank to the floor, her back against the door through which he'd walked away. Outside, the San Antonio sunset painted the sky in shades of flame, and somewhere in the city her husband was forging himself anew in the fire of her careless words. The comfortable man she'd dismissed was truly gone now, replaced by someone whose ambition would reshape not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. Dakota had wanted to wake, the dragon in him. Now she would have to live with the consequences of what she'd awakened. As night fell over the city, she remained there, the note clutched to her chest, surrounded by the remnants of their shared life. In the darkness, she finally allowed herself to weep for what she'd lost, for the comfortable love she'd taken for granted, and for the inferno that was coming. An inferno she had ignited with her own careless words. The jasmine that had witnessed their undoing still bloomed on the terrace, its sweet scent drifting through the open windows like a reminder of that fateful evening. But now it mingled with something else, the sharp, acrid smell of bridges burning, and the unmistakable scent of revenge being forged in the flames of wounded pride. Pride before the fall, they say. But in this case it wasn't clear who had fallen further, the husband who'd walked away, or the wife who remained behind, surrounded by the hollow perfection of everything they'd built together, watching it all crumble in the wake of words that could never be unsaid. The city lights winked on one by one, like stars emerging in an urban sky, each one a potential destination for a man rebuilding himself from the ground up. Somewhere out there, Maverick Gideon was transforming himself into someone new, someone dangerous, someone whose ambition would burn hot enough to consume everything in its path. And Dakota could only watch, wait, and wonder if the inferno she'd sparked would leave anything worth salvaging from the ashes of their love. Chapter 3. The Rise of a Phoenix. While Dakota grappled with the wreckage of their marriage in their hollow penthouse, Maverick Gideon was orchestrating his resurrection in a sparse downtown loft that overlooked San Antonio's financial district. The space was deliberately austere. No designer furniture, no carefully curated art pieces, nothing to remind him of the life he'd left behind, just industrial concrete walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a massive whiteboard that dominated one wall, covered in complex financial diagrams and strategic planning. The first light of dawn found him already at work, his laptop casting a blue glow across his sharpened features. The comfortable corporate banker was gone, replaced by a man who measured his worth in 18-hour workdays and calculated risks. His Tom Ford suits had been replaced by bespoke pieces in darker shades, his entire wardrobe now an armor of blacks and charcoals that matched his hardened resolve. "The market's underserved," he explained to Marcus Chen, his former colleague from Goldman Sachs, who'd been the first to answer his midnight call. Traditional investment banking is stuck in the past, playing it safe. His voice carried an edge that made Marcus glance up from the prospectus before him. We're going to change that. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. They'd worked together for 5 years, but this version of Maverick was someone entirely new. You're talking about aggressive expansion in a conservative market. The old guard won't like it. A dangerous smile played at the corners of Maverick's mouth. Good. The whiteboard behind them detailed their strategy, a series of calculated moves that would shake the foundations of Texas's financial establishment. Maverick had spent weeks identifying overlooked opportunities, weaknesses in established firms, and untapped markets that the comfortable bankers of San Antonio had deemed too risky to touch. We'll start with the tech sector, Maverick continued, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he pulled up projection models. Silicon Hills is growing, but the local firms are too traditional in their approach. They're missing the potential in blockchain technology, artificial intelligence startups, quantum computing ventures. His eyes gleamed with predatory intensity. Their loss, our gain. The sun climbed higher over the city as they worked, casting long shadows across the loft's concrete floor. Marcus watched as Maverick made call after call, his voice modulating perfectly for each conversation. Sharp and aggressive with potential investors, smoothly reassuring with hesitant clients, coldly professional with former colleagues who might be persuaded to join their venture. By mid-morning, the first pieces were falling into place. 3 major venture capitalists had agreed to meetings, intrigued by the bold strategy Maverick had outlined. 2 senior analysts from competing firms had quietly submitted their resignations, drawn by the promise of equity partnerships in what they sensed would be a revolutionary enterprise. You're moving fast, Marcus observed as Maverick ended another call. The street's already buzzing about what you're building. Maverick stood, moving to the windows that overlooked the financial district. From this height he could see the Goldman Sachs office where he'd spent years playing it safe, building the comfortable life that Dakota had grown to despise. Not fast enough. His phone buzzed with a text, another former colleague reaching out, sensing the shift in the wind. Maverick read the message with a grim smile. Word was spreading through San Antonio's financial circles that something big was coming, something that would disrupt the comfortable status quo that had dominated the market for decades. The next weeks passed in a blur of meetings, negotiations, and strategic planning. Maverick moved through the city like a force of nature, his presence sending ripples through the established order. He recruited aggressively, targeting the hungriest, most ambitious players in the market. Young analysts who'd been overlooked for promotion, senior managers frustrated by their firm's conservative approach, tech entrepreneurs who'd been dismissed by traditional banks, all found themselves drawn into Maverick's orbit. His new office suite took shape on the top floor of a gleaming tower in the heart of the financial district, the design as sharp and aggressive as its occupant. Glass and steel dominated the space, with cutting-edge technology integrated into every surface. It was a statement piece, a declaration of war against the wood-paneled old guard of San Antonio banking. Gideon Capital, Marcus read from the sleek sign being installed in the lobby. Simple, director, powerful. Maverick stood beside him, his reflection in the polished steel letters showing a man transformed. The comfortable banker who'd accepted his place in the hierarchy was gone, replaced by someone who intended to rewrite the rules entirely. "It's not just a name," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that made people lean in to listen. "It's a promise." The promise began to materialize in ways that sent shockwaves through the financial community. Gideon Capital's first moves were bold, aggressive plays that other firms had deemed too risky. They backed a series of blockchain startups that traditional banks had rejected, orchestrated a hostile takeover of a struggling tech firm that other investors had written off, and launched an AI-driven investment platform that threatened to revolutionize portfolio management. Success followed success, each victory adding fuel to Maverick's transformation. The whispers in the financial district grew louder. Maverick Gideon wasn't just building another investment firm, he was creating an empire that would reshape the landscape of Texas banking. The old guard watched with growing unease as Gideon Capital's influence spread. Clients began migrating to the new firm, drawn by its innovative approach and impressive returns. Young talent flocked to Maverick's banner, eager to be part of something revolutionary. Even the most established players in the market found themselves forced to adapt, to evolve, or risk being left behind. 6 months after that fateful night in the penthouse, Maverick stood in his new office, watching the sun set over San Antonio. The view was different here, higher, clearer, unsoftened by the comfortable luxury of his former life. The city spread out before him like a chessboard, and he was finally playing the game on his own terms. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Gideon Capital had just closed another major deal, acquiring a struggling fintech startup that would give them a decisive edge in the digital banking sector. The market was responding exactly as he'd predicted, his former competitors scrambling to catch up, their comfortable strategies crumbling in the face of his relentless innovation. Marcus appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "The numbers for Q3 are in. We've exceeded every projection." He paused, studying his friend and mentor. "You've done it, Maverick. You've built something extraordinary." Maverick didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the cityscape before him. The comfortable man who'd accepted his place in the corporate hierarchy was dead, replaced by someone who made even the city's most powerful players nervous. He'd become exactly what Dakota had wished for, ambitious, driven, unstoppable. But the victory tasted hollow without her there to witness it. The sun's last rays caught the obsidian surface of his desk, where a single photograph lay face down, the only personal item in the otherwise pristine space. He hadn't looked at it in months, hadn't allowed himself the luxury of remembering the happiness captured in that moment. It was from their honeymoon in Tuscany, when they'd spent lazy afternoons dreaming of the future they'd build together. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd finally become the man Dakota had wanted him to be, driven by the very words that had destroyed their marriage. The fire she'd accused him of losing now burned hot enough to reshape the financial landscape of Texas, but it had consumed everything soft and comfortable in his life, including their love. As night fell over San Antonio, Maverick Gideon stood alone in his empire of glass and steel, surrounded by the trappings of success he'd built from the ashes of his comfortable life. The phoenix had risen, transformed by the very flames that had destroyed him. But the cost of that transformation was etched in every hard line of his face, every calculated decision, every victory that felt empty without someone to share it with. The city lights winked on below, each one a reminder of the power he'd accumulated, the respect he'd commanded, the fear he'd inspired. He'd given Dakota exactly what she'd asked for, a man with fire in his eyes and ambition in his heart. But in doing so, he'd become someone even he sometimes didn't recognize. The comfortable corporate drone was well and truly dead. In his place stood a man who commanded attention, who made things happen, who reshaped reality through sheer force of will. Maverick Gideon had risen from the ashes of his former life, transformed by hurt and ambition into something dangerous and powerful. But on nights like this, alone in his tower of glass and steel, he sometimes wondered if the price of transformation had been too high. Chapter 4. Sister's Keeper. Valeria Martinez stood at the window of her hill country ranch, watching storm clouds gather over the distant peaks. Her sister's text messages had been growing increasingly desperate over the past weeks, each one a digital testament to Dakota's crumbling world. The latest one glowed on her phone screen. "I don't know who I am without him anymore." The irony wasn't lost on Valeria. For 8 years, she'd watched her sister and Maverick build their perfect life, all while harboring a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. Now, as Dakota's carefully constructed world fell apart, that secret threatened to surface like a hurricane-tossed buoy, pulling at the chains that had kept it submerged for so long. "Coming, sis," she typed back, her manicured nails clicking against the screen. The response felt inadequate. But what could she say? That she'd seen this coming, that she'd watched Dakota take Maverick for granted, watched the fire in his eyes dim year by year, and said nothing. The drive into San Antonio gave her too much time to think. As her Range Rover wound through the hill country roads, memories surfaced unbidden. The startup conference where they'd all first met, Dakota commanding attention in her red power suit, Maverick captivating the room with his vision for the future of banking, and Valeria standing in the shadows, feeling the first spark of something she'd spent years trying to extinguish. The security guard at Dakota's building recognized her, offering a sympathetic smile as she parked. News of the Gideon separation had spread through San Antonio's social circles like wildfire, each retelling more dramatic than the last. The latest whispers painted Maverick as a man possessed, building an empire from spite and wounded pride. "Val!" Dakota's voice cracked as she opened the door. Her sister, always so perfectly put together, looked like a ghost of herself. Gone were the designer dresses and careful makeup. Instead, she wore old yoga pants and one of Maverick's forgotten Harvard Business School sweatshirts, her face bare and haunted. The penthouse, once a showcase of their success, felt like a museum of loss. Fresh flowers that had been Dakota's signature touch were conspicuously absent. In their place, half-empty wine glasses and scattered papers covered every surface, each one bearing Maverick's bold signature: divorce papers, property settlements, financial statements. "Oh, honey," Valeria breathed, pulling her sister into a tight embrace. Dakota collapsed against her, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. They stood like that in the foyer, the evening sun casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, while the city hummed with life below. Later, curled up on the Minotti sectional that had cost more than most cars, Dakota clutched a glass of wine like a lifeline. "Have you seen the news? He's everywhere, Val. Every financial publication, every business section. Maverick Gideon, the rise of a financial phoenix." She laughed bitterly. "I wanted him to find his fire again. Instead, I lit a match that burned everything to the ground." Valeria studied her sister's profile, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. "You couldn't have known he'd react this way." "Couldn't I?" Dakota turned to face her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I knew exactly who he was when I married him. That ambition, that drive, it was always there, just waiting for the right spark. I just never thought—" She trailed off, staring into her wineglass as if it held answers. "Never thought what?" "That I'd be the one to wake it up by breaking his heart." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Valeria felt her own heart twist, remembering moments she'd carefully filed away. Maverick's rare, genuine smiles, the intensity in his eyes when he spoke about his dreams, the way he'd looked at her that night at the conference before Dakota walked into the room. "I see him sometimes," Dakota continued, oblivious to her sister's inner turmoil. "From a distance. He's different now, sharper, colder. The whole financial district's talking about him, how he's revolutionizing investment banking, how he's building something unprecedented." She drew a shaky breath. "They say he works 18-hour days, sleeps in his office, lives on coffee and ambition." Valeria's phone buzzed. A news alert about Gideon Capital's latest acquisition. The accompanying photo showed Maverick in a black suit that emphasized his transformation. Gone was the comfortable banker. In his place stood someone dangerous and compelling. Someone who looked remarkably like the man she'd first met all those years ago. Maybe, Valeria suggested carefully, this is who he always was. Maybe the comfortable life was the mask, and this is him without it. Dakota's laugh was hollow. And I'm the one who ripped it off. God, Val, what have I done? I didn't just lose my husband. I created someone I don't even recognize anymore. The sun had set completely now, leaving them in the dim glow of city lights. In the distance, the illuminated windows of the financial district sparkled like stars, and somewhere in one of those towers, Maverick Gideon was building his empire, one calculated move at a time. "Have you tried talking to him?" Valeria asked, though she already knew the answer. "He won't see me, won't take my calls. Everything goes through lawyers now." Dakota's voice cracked. "The man I married, the one who used to bring me coffee in bed and leave silly notes in my briefcase, he's just gone. And this new version, he's untouchable." Valeria pulled her sister close, offering comfort while fighting her own turbulent emotions. Because the truth was, she did recognize this version of Maverick. She saw in him the same fire, the same intensity that had drawn her to him that first night at the conference. Before Dakota had walked in, before fate had chosen her sister's path over hers. As the night deepened, Dakota finally fell into an exhausted sleep on the sectional. Valeria covered her with a cashmere throw, then moved to the windows, staring out at the city that seemed to pulse with Maverick's newfound power. Her phone buzzed again. Another news alert. Gideon Capital had just announced a revolutionary new investment platform. The article included a quote from Maverick that made her breath catch. "Comfort is the enemy of greatness. Sometimes we need to burn it all down to build something extraordinary." In the quiet of the penthouse, surrounded by the remnants of her sister's shattered marriage, Valeria felt the weight of her long-buried feelings pressing against her chest. She'd spent 8 years being the perfect sister, the loyal friend, the keeper of secrets. But now, watching Maverick's rise and Dakota's fall, she couldn't help but wonder if the time for secrets was finally over. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the windows. Lightning illuminated the city in stark flashes, each burst revealing a different facet of the truth Valeria had hidden for so long. She had never stopped seeing the fire in Maverick's eyes, had never stopped wondering what might have been if she'd spoken up that night at the conference, had never truly let go of the man who had become her sister's husband. Now, as Dakota slept fitfully behind her and San Antonio's financial district glowed with the light of Maverick's ambition, Valeria faced a choice. She could remain the faithful sister, helping Dakota pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Or she could finally acknowledge the feelings she'd buried for 8 years, feelings that grew stronger with each news article, each glimpse of the man Maverick had become. The storm raged on, matching the turmoil in her heart. In her sleep, Dakota murmured Maverick's name, the sound both a prayer and a curse, and Valeria stood watch over her sister's broken dreams, knowing that her own carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble, one forbidden memory at a time. Chapter 5. Dangerous Games. The Pearl District's historic brewery complex glowed like a jewel against the velvet night sky, its industrial architecture transformed by thousands of twinkling lights. San Antonio's elite moved through the restored space in waves of designer evening wear and carefully cultivated influence, gathered for the annual Children's Hospital Foundation Gala. The air hummed with possibility and tension, perfumed with money and power. Dakota stood before the gilt-edged mirror in the ladies' lounge, applying a fresh coat of Chanel Rouge Allure, pirate red, his favorite. The irony of wearing it tonight wasn't lost. On her, 8 months of separation had transformed her into someone else, someone harder and more deliberate. The black Carolina Herrera gown she'd chosen was a weapon in its own right, its dramatic silhouette a declaration of war. "You're playing with fire," Valeria's voice came from behind her, reflection appearing like a ghost in the mirror. Her sister wore emerald silk that made her eyes seem almost feline in the soft lighting. "He'll be here tonight." "I know." Dakota's hand remained steady as she recapped the lipstick. "That's rather the point." The main hall of the Pearl was a masterpiece of restoration, its soaring ceilings and exposed brick walls creating an atmosphere of industrial elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the gathering of San Antonio's most powerful players, all of them pretending they weren't watching the doors with barely concealed anticipation. Maverick Gideon's arrival sent a ripple through the crowd. He moved through the space like a perfectly tailored shark, his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo emphasizing the lean hunger of his transformation. The comfortable banker was well and truly gone. In his place stood someone who made the city's old guard shift nervously in their Salvatore Ferragamo loafers. "Quite an entrance," Marcus Chen murmured at his side, nodding toward the barely concealed reactions of their competitors. "Though I think your ex-wife might have you beat." Maverick's eyes found Dakota across the room, drawn by some magnetic force that 8 months of separation hadn't managed to break. She was devastating in black, the dress a study in calculated revenge. Their gazes locked for a moment that seemed to stop time, the air between them charged with unfinished business and unspoken accusations. Then Valeria appeared at Dakota's side, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "This should be interesting," Marcus commented, watching the tableau unfold. "The whole financial district's been taking bets on how this night would play out." Maverick's response was cut off by the approach of Richard Montgomery, CEO of one of San Antonio's oldest investment firms. "Gideon," the older man's voice carried forced joviality, "quite the splash you've been making, though some might say your methods are a bit aggressive." "Some might," Maverick agreed, his smile sharp as a razor. "Though I find comfort breeds complacency. Don't you agree, Richard?" The emphasis on the first name was subtle but deliberate, a reminder that the old hierarchies no longer applied. Across the room, Dakota watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and pain. This was the man she'd wanted, ambitious, powerful, unstoppable. The irony of getting exactly what she'd wished for wasn't lost on her. "You're staring," Valeria whispered, pressing a fresh glass of champagne into her sister's hand. Her fingers lingered a moment too long on Dakota's wrist, steadying her. "The vultures are watching." Indeed, San Antonio's social elite were pretending not to observe the unfolding drama. 8 months of speculation about the Gideon separation had fueled countless dinner party conversations. Now, with all 3 players on the same stage, the audience was hungry for the next act. The evening progressed like a carefully choreographed dance, each movement calculated for maximum impact. Maverick worked the room with predatory grace. Every handshake and conversation another move in his ongoing campaign to reshape the city's financial landscape. Dakota held court near the restored copper kettles, her laughter carrying just far enough to reach his ears. And Valeria moved between them like a ghost, her emerald dress catching the light as she navigated the dangerous waters of divided loyalties. "You've done well for yourself," Dakota's voice came from behind him during a rare moment alone. Maverick turned to find her closer than he'd expected, close enough to catch the familiar scent of her perfume, Clive Christian #1, the same one he'd given her on their last anniversary. "Isn't this what you wanted?" His voice was low, meant only for her, a man with fire in his eyes. "I wanted my husband back." The words carried more vulnerability than she'd intended. "Not this avenging angel you've become." "Your husband." His laugh was soft but cutting. The comfortable corporate drone? I think your exact words were that you wouldn't give him a second glance. Maverick. She reached for him, but he stepped back, maintaining the careful distance between them. 8 months ago, those words shattered everything we built. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man she'd married. Now they're the foundation of everything I'm building. The moment was interrupted by Valeria's appearance at Dakota's elbow. The hospital board's asking for you, Dakota. Something about the pediatric wing donation. The sisters moved away, but not before Maverick caught the look that passed between them, something complicated and dangerous, heavy with unspoken tensions. He'd seen that look before, at their wedding, though he'd been too comfortable then to recognize its significance. As the night wore on, the careful choreography began to fray at the edges. Dakota's laughter became a touch too bright, Maverick's responses a shade too sharp. And Valeria watched them both with eyes that held too many secrets. It happened during the live auction. Dakota had taken the stage to introduce the next item, a weekend at her family's hill country estate, complete with private chef and sommelier. The spotlight caught her perfectly, making the diamonds at her throat throw prismatic patterns across the restored brick walls. The starting bid, she announced, her voice carrying clear and strong, is $50,000. 100,000. Maverick's voice cut through the murmurs, drawing every eye in the room. He stood at the back, champagne flute held negligently in one hand, every inch the financial titan he'd become. Dakota's composure slipped for just a moment before she recovered. $100,000 from Mr. Gideon. Do I hear 125? The bidding war that followed was less about the hill country estate and more about the unspoken battle between former husband and wife. When Maverick finally won with a bid of $500,000, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Quite a statement, Valeria observed later, finding him alone on the terrace. The night air was heavy with the scent of jasmine, reminiscent of another evening 8 months ago. Though I'm curious, do you actually plan to use the estate? He turned to face her, noting the way the moonlight caught the emerald silk of her dress. Why? Are you offering to be my guide? The question hung in the air between them, charged with possibilities neither of them should be considering. Valeria took a step closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, different from Dakota's, something darker and more complex. We both know that would be dangerous, she said softly, but didn't step back. Inside, Dakota searched the crowd for either her sister or her husband, unaware that they were creating their own dangerous moment under the Texas stars. The gala was winding down, but the real games were just beginning. As the last guest departed and the Pearl's historic halls emptied, 3 separate cars pulled away into the San Antonio night. Each carried a player in this unfolding drama, each headed in a different direction, but bound together by chains of love, betrayal, and unspoken desires. Maverick returned to his glass tower, where the lights of his empire burned bright against the night sky. Dakota made her way back to their former penthouse, now a museum of memories she couldn't bring herself to pack away. And Valeria. Valeria drove toward the hill country, her hands tight on the steering wheel, as she fought against thoughts she'd kept buried for 8 long years. The night had changed something between them all, shifted the careful balance they'd maintained since the separation. In trying to maintain their distances, they'd only drawn closer together, like planets locked in a dangerous orbit, drawing ever nearer to collision. The games they were playing had never been more dangerous, the stakes never higher. Because now it wasn't just about a marriage destroyed by careless words or an empire built from wounded pride. Now it was about 3 hearts beating out of sync, 3 sets of secrets threatening to spill over, and one undeniable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous games are the ones we play with ourselves. Chapter 6. The Betrayal. The lights of downtown San Antonio painted shadows across Valeria's face as she sat in her parked car outside Gideon Capital's headquarters. The manila envelope on her passenger seat seemed to pulse with dangerous energy. Inside were documents that could either protect or destroy her sister, depending on how she chose to use them. Dakota's latest attempt at reconciliation had been making its way through the legal channels. Pages of carefully worded proposals, olive branches wrapped in legal terminology, all designed to bridge the chasm that had grown between her and Maverick. But there was something her sister didn't know, something that had been eating at Valeria's conscience since she'd discovered it 3 days ago. "This is to protect him," she whispered to her reflection in the rearview mirror, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Dakota's proposal would destroy everything he's built. The security guard recognized her from the gala, nodding her through with a smile that made her guilt twist deeper. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, each floor bringing her closer to a decision she couldn't take back. Maverick's office was exactly what she'd expected, all glass and steel and calculated intimidation. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette cut sharp against the city lights. The comfortable banker was gone, replaced by someone who commanded attention simply by existing. Valeria. He turned, and she saw the surprise flash across his features before his careful mask slipped back into place. "It's late. We need to talk about Dakota." She moved further into the office, the envelope heavy in her hands. About her reconciliation attempt. Something darkened in his eyes at the mention of his wife's name. "The lawyers are handling that." "The lawyers don't know what I know." She placed the envelope on his desk, watching as he reached for it with deliberate slowness. "Her proposal isn't just about reconciliation. She's planning to use her firm's influence to force a merger, take control of everything you've built." The silence that followed was absolute. Maverick opened the envelope, scanning the documents with increasing intensity. Valeria watched the transformation happen, saw the last traces of the man her sister had married fade away, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "Why are you showing me this?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but she could hear the storm building beneath the surface. Valeria moved closer, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne. Something darker than he used to wear, like his transformation extended even to this detail. "Because I've watched you rebuild yourself from the ashes she created, because what she's planning, it's wrong. And betraying your sister is right." There was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity. "Sometimes protection requires betrayal." She met his gaze steadily. "You taught me that, the night you walked away from her." The tension between them shifted, became something electric and dangerous. Maverick moved around the desk until they were standing face to face, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his storm-gray eyes. "You've changed too," he observed, studying her with new intensity. "The loyal sister act is slipping." "Maybe it was always an act." The words came out before she could stop them, heavy with 8 years of buried truth. Their late-night strategy sessions became a regular occurrence, each meeting charged with unspoken possibilities. They pored over financial reports, market analyses, contingency plans, all while dancing around the growing attraction neither would acknowledge. "You could have had this empire," Maverick said one night, watching her dissect a particularly complex market strategy. "You have better instincts than half the sharks in this district." Valeria looked up from the spreadsheets, a sad smile playing at her lips. "I had other obligations. Family loyalty is a heavy chain." And now? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Outside, a summer storm was building, lightning illuminating the office in stark flashes that made everything feel slightly unreal. Now. She stood, moving to the windows to watch the approaching storm. Now, I'm tired of being the good sister, the loyal friend, the keeper of everyone's secrets but my own. He joined her at the window, their reflections overlapping in the glass. What secrets are those? Thunder rolled across the city as she turned to face him. 8 years of careful distance evaporated in the charged air between them. You know which ones, Maverick. You've always known. The kiss, when it came, felt like both an ending and a beginning. All the careful walls they'd built, the loyalties they'd maintained, crumbled in the face of something that had been brewing since that first conference, before fate and circumstance had chosen different paths for them. Later, as dawn painted the sky in shades of guilt, Valeria gathered her things to leave. The weight of what they'd done settled over her like a heavy cloak, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She'll find out, Maverick said quietly, watching her collect the scattered papers that had been forgotten in the heat of the moment. I know. Valeria paused at the door, looking back at the man who had finally become everything her sister had wanted, only to fall into her arms instead. But we've all been playing parts for so long. Maybe it's time for the truth. The private investigator's photos arrived on Dakota's desk a week later, crisp, color images that told a story she couldn't bear to read. Maverick and Valeria, intimate and comfortable, leaving his office in the early hours. Her sister's emerald dress catching the morning light, his hand at the small of her back, possessive and familiar. The betrayal was complete, perfect in its devastating simplicity. The careful distance Valeria had maintained, the late nights she'd been unavailable, the subtle changes in her behavior, all of it crystallized into a truth that Dakota had been too blind to see. In her pristine penthouse, surrounded by the remnants of her marriage, Dakota traced the edges of the photographs with trembling fingers. The storm that had been building finally broke. Rain lashing against the windows like nature itself was weeping for her loss. But something else was building beneath her grief. Something harder, colder, more dangerous than anything she'd felt before. Because this wasn't just about losing her husband anymore. This was about a betrayal that cut to the bone, about a sister who had waited in the wings all along, about a truth that would destroy more than just a marriage. The game they were playing had just become infinitely more dangerous, and Dakota was finally ready to show them both that she'd never really been the good girl they'd thought she was. After all, she'd broken Maverick once before, with nothing but carefully chosen words. Now, she had so much more than words at her disposal. Thunder rolled across San Antonio, a prelude to the storm that was about to break over all their lives. In his glass tower, Maverick held Valeria close, both of them knowing that their secret was out, but unable to step back from the precipice they'd created. And in her penthouse, Dakota began to plan a revenge that would make Maverick's transformation look like child's play. The betrayal was complete, but the real danger was just beginning. Chapter 7. Blood runs cold. The Martinez family estate sprawled across 20 acres of Texas Hill country, its limestone walls holding generations of secrets. As Dakota's Audi R8 crunched up the gravel driveway, memories assaulted her with every turn, teaching Valeria to ride in the paddock behind the house, sharing secrets under the ancient oak tree, making promises of eternal sisterhood that now tasted like ash in her mouth. The private investigator's photos lay on the passenger seat, each one a dagger aimed at the heart of their relationship. She'd spent 3 days studying them, memorizing every detail, Valeria's emerald dress wrinkled from hours in Maverick's office, his hand possessive at the small of her back, the intimate familiarity in their body language that spoke of more than just a single indiscretion. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Dakota parked beside Valeria's Range Rover. The approaching storm felt appropriate. Nature itself seemed to understand that this confrontation would change everything. She found her sister in their mother's rose garden, pruning the antique varieties with the same careful precision she'd always applied to maintaining appearances. Valeria looked up at Dakota's approach, her hands stilling on the secateurs. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, that Judgment Day had finally arrived. "I was wondering when you'd come," Valeria said quietly, setting aside her gardening tools. She wore simple linen pants and a silk blouse, her dark hair caught up in a casual knot. She looked exactly like the sister Dakota had trusted all her life, which made the betrayal cut even deeper. "Were you?" Dakota's voice carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. She pulled the photos from her designer tote, letting them scatter across the garden table like fallen leaves. "Were you wondering when I'd discover this too?" Valeria didn't flinch at the images, didn't try to deny what they showed. Instead, she met Dakota's gaze with a steadiness that spoke of preparation for this moment. "Would you believe me if I said it wasn't planned? Like you didn't plan to want him from the beginning?" The words exploded from Dakota, carrying years of subconscious suspicion. "I saw the way you looked at him, even at my wedding. I just never thought you'd actually what? Actually stop playing the perfect sister, the loyal friend, the keeper of everyone else's happiness but my own." Valeria's calm cracked, revealing something fiercer underneath. "You have no idea what it was like, watching you take him for granted year after year." Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the garden furniture. Fat drops of rain began to fall, but neither sister moved to seek shelter. "Take him for granted." Dakota's laugh was bitter as aloe. "I loved him enough to push him to be better, to be more than just another corporate drone. Everything he is now, everything he's built, it's because I saw his potential." "No." Valeria stepped closer, rain darkening her silk blouse. "It's because you broke him. I was there that night, remember? On the phone when you shattered everything, and I've been there every step since, watching him rebuild himself from the ashes you created. So that gives you the right to sleep with my husband." "Ex-husband," Valeria corrected, the words falling like ice between them. "You lost that claim when you decided he wasn't good enough anymore." The rain fell harder now, plastering their clothes to their skin, but the sisters remained locked in their confrontation, years of unspoken resentment finally finding voice. "You were always jealous." Dakota's voice trembled with rage and hurt. "Even when we were children, I got the lead in school plays you understudied. I was valedictorian, you were salutatorian. I caught Maverick's attention at that conference. After I'd spent the entire evening talking to him, Valeria's composure shattered completely. You swept in at the last moment, all perfect hair and practiced charm, and he looked at you like I'd ceased to exist. Do you have any idea what that felt like?" "Poor Valeria," Dakota's voice dripped venom. "Always second best, always in my shadow. Is that what this is about? Finally taking something that was mine?" "He stopped being yours the moment you decided he wasn't enough." Valeria moved closer, rain running down her face like tears. "I saw him, Dakota. Really saw him. Not as a project to be improved, not as arm candy for your perfect life, but as a man. A man with dreams and fears and a heart you carelessly broke. And you were there to pick up the pieces, weren't you? Such a caring sister." Dakota's hand shot out, gripping Valeria's arm. "Tell me, how long did you wait after he left? A week? A day? Or did you finally make your move that very night?" Valeria didn't pull away from her sister's grip. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I waited 8 years. 8 years of watching you dim his fire, of seeing you turn him into something safe and comfortable because it fit your perfect image. 8 years of keeping my feelings buried because that's what good sisters do. And now," Dakota's grip tightened, "now you're just taking what you want?" Now I'm done pretending, done watching from the sidelines, done being the good sister who sacrifices everything for your happiness." Valeria finally pulled free, her eyes flashing with years of suppressed emotion. "You threw him away, Dakota. You never deserved him." The words hung between them, impossible to take back. Thunder rolled across the hill country like nature's own commentary on their shattered relationship. "Get out." Dakota's voice was deadly quiet. "Get out of this house. Get out of my life. You're no sister of mine." Valeria gathered her things with deliberate slowness, each movement a statement. At the garden gate, she paused, looking back at the sister she'd both loved and resented all her life. "You know what the worst part is? He was right about you. You only want him now because someone else does." She walked away, leaving Dakota standing in the rain-soaked rose garden their mother had so lovingly tended. The carefully pruned bushes bore witness to the end of a sisterhood that had weathered everything but this final, unforgivable betrayal. Later, as the storm cleared and the hill country sun painted the wet limestone walls gold, Dakota sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by trophies and ribbons that marked her lifelong victory over her sister. Each one now felt like evidence in a case she hadn't known she was building, proof of a rivalry that had finally found its breaking point. The photos lay scattered across her childhood desk, water-damaged, but still clear enough to tell their story. In one, Maverick smiled at Valeria with an openness Dakota hadn't seen in years. In another, her sister's hand rested on his chest with casual intimacy. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a last warning of storms to come. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dakota had lost her husband to her own careless words, but she'd be damned if she'd lose him to her sister's careful manipulation. The game they were playing had just changed rules, and Dakota was finally ready to show them both that being first hadn't just been luck, it had been strategy, determination, and a willingness to do whatever it took to win. Blood might be thicker than water, but betrayal ran thicker than both. Chapter 8. The Price of Pride. Success had a peculiar taste, Maverick discovered, as he stood in his glass-walled office watching the sun set over San Antonio's financial district. Gideon Capital's latest acquisition had just been announced, sending shockwaves through the market. His empire now stretched across Texas, each victory another brick in the fortress he'd built from wounded pride and stubborn determination. But tonight, surrounded by the trappings of his transformation, the triumph felt hollow. His reflection in the window showed a stranger, someone harder, colder, dressed in custom Tom Ford black, like he was perpetually in mourning for the man he used to be. The bottle of Macallan 25 on his desk caught the fading light, amber liquid glowing like trapped sunlight. It was Dakota's favorite, though she'd only indulge on special occasions. The memory of their last shared drink hit him with unexpected force. Their 5th anniversary, both of them curled up on their penthouse balcony, planning a future that now lay in ruins. "The board approved the merger," Marcus announced, from the doorway, tablet in hand. "Montgomery and Sons didn't stand a chance. Old Richard looked like he was having a stroke when we presented the final terms." Maverick nodded, not turning from the window. Richard Montgomery had been one of his earliest mentors at Goldman Sachs, had even attended their wedding. Now his former mentor's firm was just another trophy in Gideon Capital's growing collection. "Should I have the PR team prepare a statement?" Marcus asked, studying his friend with barely concealed concern. "Let them sweat tonight," Maverick replied, his voice carrying an edge that would have been foreign to him 8 months ago. "We'll announce it at tomorrow's opening bell. Maximum impact." Marcus lingered, clearly wanting to say more. Their friendship had weathered Maverick's transformation, but lately he'd noticed his oldest friend watching him with something like worry in his eyes. "Spit it out, Marcus." "Valeria called 3 times today." Marcus set the tablet down carefully. "And Dakota's been making waves at the exchange. There's talk she's positioning for something big. The mention of both women's names in such close proximity made something twist in Maverick's chest. The sisters had become opposite poles of his new existence. Valeria representing the passionate present, Dakota the comfortable past he'd burned to ash. "Let them play their games," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus crossed the office, pouring 2 fingers of the Macallan into heavy crystal tumblers. "You're playing with fire, my friend. These women, they're not just moves on a chessboard." Maverick accepted the offered drink, the familiar scent bringing unwanted memories. "Everything's a move now. That's what she wanted, isn't it? A man with fire in his eyes." His laugh was sharp enough to cut. "Well, she got her wish. I'm burning everything down, including yourself." The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortably close to truths Maverick had been avoiding. He took a slow sip of scotch, letting the burn ground him in the present. "You should have seen them at the gala," he said finally, his voice distant. "Dakota, in that black dress, every inch the woman I married but somehow more dangerous, and Valeria." He trailed off, remembering the way the emerald silk had caught the light, the way her eyes had held secrets he was only beginning to understand. 2 sisters, Marcus mused, swirling his scotch. One who broke your heart to make you greater. One who helped put it back together for her own reasons. The financial district's better than a telenovela these days. Maverick shot him a sharp look, but there was no judgment in his friend's tone, only concern. "You know what the worst part is?" Maverick moved to his desk, running his fingers over the acquisition papers that represented his latest victory. "Some nights, I miss being comfortable. Miss the man who brought Dakota coffee in bed and left silly notes in her briefcase. The man who had nothing to prove." "That man still exists," Marcus said quietly. "He's just buried under all this." He gestured at the office, the empire, the carefully constructed facade of power. That man was weak. That man was happy. The words landed like a physical blow. Maverick turned back to the window where the city lights were beginning to twinkle on like stars. His empire spread out before him, each building a testament to his transformation, each victory another step away from the comfortable life he'd lost. "Happiness is a luxury I can't afford anymore," he said finally. This is what she wanted, a man with ambition, with fire, someone who wouldn't settle for mediocrity. And Valeria? Is she just another move in this game of yours? The question cut closer to the bone than Maverick would admit. His nights with Valeria had begun as strategy sessions, evolved into something more complicated. She saw him clearly, accepted both the man he'd been and the one he'd become. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he caught her watching him with something like sadness in her eyes. It's not that simple. It never is with sisters. Marcus finished his scotch and set the glass down with deliberate care. But sooner or later you're going to have to decide what matters more. This empire you've built, or the hearts you're playing with. After Marcus left, Maverick remained in his office, watching night claim the city. The acquisition papers on his desk represented another victory, another step toward, what? Revenge, validation. The comfortable man he'd been would know the answer, but that man was gone, replaced by someone who measured success in conquered territory and broken competitors. His phone buzzed. Valeria again. He let it go to voicemail, her name glowing on the screen like an accusation. Another buzz followed moments later. Dakota, her name appearing below her sister's in some cosmic joke of timing. The sisters who had shaped his transformation, each in their own way. Dakota's cruel words had been the spark, but Valeria's quiet support had fueled the fire. Now he was caught between them, burning in flames of his own making. The Macallan caught the light of his desk lamp, reminding him of softer times, of lazy Sunday mornings and shared dreams. Success had a peculiar taste indeed, like ashes and ambition, like scotch drunk alone in a glass tower while the past and present waged war in his heart. Pride had built this empire, but the price was mounting. Every victory took him further from the man he'd been, closer to someone he sometimes didn't recognize in the mirror. The comfortable banker was well and truly gone. But on nights like this, surrounded by the symbols of his success, Maverick couldn't help but wonder if the cost had been too high. The city lights blurred before him, each one a star in the constellation of his ambition. Somewhere out there, two sisters fought their own battles, their love and hatred for him burning bright enough to light the Texas sky. And here he stood, in his tower of glass and steel, caught between past and present, between comfort and ambition, between the man he'd been and the one he'd become. Pride, it seemed, was a currency that demanded payment in flesh and blood, in broken hearts and shattered dreams, and the bill was coming due. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Past. The storm that had been threatening San Antonio all day finally broke as Dakota stood in the marble lobby of Gideon Capital. Lightning illuminated the sleek space in harsh bursts, thunder rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows with enough force to make the security guard glance up nervously from his desk. She was soaked from the short dash from her car, her Louboutins leaving wet marks on the polished floor. Her reflection in the chrome elevator doors showed someone both familiar and strange, hair darkened by rain, makeup running slightly, but eyes burning with an intensity that matched the storm outside. "Mr. Gideon is in a meeting," his executive assistant began, rising from behind her desk as Dakota stepped onto the top floor. One look at Dakota's face made her sink back into her chair. Some things trumped corporate protocol, and the sight of the CEO's estranged wife, drenched and determined, was clearly one of them. Maverick's voice carried through his partially open office door. He was on a video call, his tone carrying that new edge of authority she both admired and mourned. Dakota paused in the doorway, watching him command the virtual room with the kind of presence she'd always known he possessed. "The merger terms are non-negotiable," he was saying, his back to the door as he faced the wall of screens. "You have until morning to decide. After that, we'll proceed with the hostile takeover as planned." The storm chose that moment to crash directly overhead, the thunder so loud it made the windows vibrate. Maverick turned at the sound, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, hunter and hunted, though it wasn't clear which was which. "I'll call you back," he said into the camera, not taking his eyes off Dakota. The screens went dark with a soft chime, leaving them alone in his glass kingdom while nature raged outside. "You're wet," he observed, his voice carefully neutral. "It's raining." She moved further into the office, leaving damp footprints on his expensive carpet. "Or haven't you noticed the world outside your tower lately?" The ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first real emotion she'd seen from him in months. "I've been busy." "Building your empire." She ran a finger along his desk, taking in the acquisition papers, the multiple monitors, the trappings of power he'd surrounded himself with. "Is it everything you hoped for? Isn't this what you wanted?" He leaned against his desk, loosening his tie slightly. A man with fire in his eyes, someone who wouldn't settle for mediocrity. "I wanted my husband back." The words escaped before she could stop them, raw with honesty. "Not this avenging angel you've become." Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating his face in stark relief. For a moment she saw both versions of him overlaid, the comfortable banker she'd married and the dangerous force he'd become. "Your husband?" His laugh was soft but cutting. "The corporate drone? I think your exact words were that you wouldn't give him a second glance." "I was scared," she whispered, the confession drawing her closer to him. "Scared that you'd settled because of me, that I'd clipped your wings. I wanted to push you to be great again, but I chose the worst possible way. So instead you broke everything we built. His voice carried 8 months of accumulated pain. Shattered our marriage with a few careful words, then watched me burn it all down and build it back up. And found comfort in my sister's arms. The words tasted like poison, but she forced them out. Was that part of the plan too? Something flickered across his face, guilt perhaps, or regret. The storm pressed against the windows like a living thing, matching the tension in the room. Valeria understands me, he said finally. She sees me clearly, accepts both versions. She's been in love with you since the conference. Dakota's laugh was bitter as aloe. Did you know that? She told me herself during our little sisterly confrontation. 8 years she waited, watching, wanting what was mine. What was yours? Now anger crept into his voice. You threw me away, Dakota. Decided I wasn't enough anymore. And now you're here, what? To claim ownership? To mark your territory? I'm here because I miss you. The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Not the empire builder, not the financial titan, just you. The man who brought me coffee in bed and left silly notes in my briefcase. The man who knew every detail of my day because he actually listened when I talked. Maverick moved away from the desk, putting distance between them. That man was weak. That man was loved. Lightning illuminated the office again, catching the crystal decanter of Macallan on his desk, their special occasion drink. Some habits, it seemed, died harder than others. Do you remember our first apartment? She asked suddenly, moving to the windows. That tiny place off Broadway, with the window unit that never worked right, and the neighbor's cat that kept breaking in. Dakota. We had nothing but dreams then, she continued, pressing her palm against the cold glass. You'd sketch out plans for your own firm on takeout napkins, and I'd add little notes in the margins. We were happy, weren't we? Before the success, before the penthouse, before I forgot how to appreciate the fire in you because I was too busy trying to control it. Thunder rolled across the city, but softer now, the storm beginning to pass. Maverick's reflection appeared beside hers in the window, close enough to touch, but separated by 8 months of pain and pride. We can't go back, he said quietly. I don't want to go back. She turned to face him, close enough now to catch the familiar scent of his cologne. I want to go forward, but I want to do it with the man I married, not this carefully constructed version of him. And Valeria? The question hung between them, sharp as broken glass. Dakota's hands clenched at her sides, fighting the urge to reach for him. She loves the man you've become, she said finally. I love the man you've always been, even when that man was hidden behind Brooks Brothers suits and corporate caution, even when I was too blind to see it. Lightning flickered again, distant now, the storm moving away across the city. In its wake, the office felt too quiet, too intimate, charged with possibility and pain. I was wrong, she whispered, taking a step closer. Not about wanting you to reach higher, I'll always want that for you, but about how I said it, about making you feel like you weren't enough. Because you were always enough, Maverick. I just forgot how to show you that. Something cracked in his carefully maintained facade. His hand lifted, almost touching her face before dropping back to his side. Do you know what it's like? His voice was rough with emotion. Building all of this, achieving everything we once dreamed about, only to find that success tastes like ashes because you're not here to share it. Then let me share it. She closed the distance between them, her hand finding his chest, feeling his heart race beneath expensive wool and pride. Not as the woman who broke your heart, but as the one who's finally learned to appreciate it. All of it. The fire and the calm, the ambition and the comfort. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind a silence that felt like holding breath. Outside the windows, the city glittered with rain and possibility, each light a star in the constellation of their shared history. "It's not that simple," he said, but his hand had found her waist, muscle memory overriding months of carefully maintained distance. "It never was," she agreed. "But maybe that's what I got wrong before. Maybe the point isn't to be simple or comfortable. Maybe it's about finding someone who loves all your versions, the comfortable and the dangerous, the dreamer and the achiever." His other hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. "And you think that's you? After everything?" "I think it's always been me," she whispered. "I just had to lose you to understand that." The kiss, when it came, tasted like rain and scotch and possibility. Not the comfortable kisses they'd shared in their later years, not the passionate ones from their early days, but something new, something that acknowledged both their past and their potential future. When they finally broke apart, the city had dried its tears, stars peeking through. Breaks in the clouds. They stood in his glass tower, surrounded by the empire he'd built from her careless words, both of them changed by the flames of transformation. "This doesn't fix everything," he said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. "I know." She smiled slightly, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "But maybe it's a start, a new beginning, with both of us finally seeing each other clearly." The elevator dinged in the distance, followed by the sharp click of heels on marble. They broke apart, just as Valeria appeared in the doorway, her face a study in complex emotions as she took in the scene before her. The game they were playing had just changed rules again, and as the sisters locked eyes across Maverick's office, both of them knew that the real storm was just beginning. But for now, in this moment between lightning and thunder, between past and future, Dakota and Maverick stood together in the eye of the storm they'd created, finally ready to face whatever came next, together. Chapter 10. The Unraveling. The first light of dawn painted San Antonio's skyline in shades of guilt and possibility as Maverick Gideon stood in his office, caught between the sister he'd married and the one who'd helped him rebuild. The storm had passed, but the air still crackled with dangerous energy, like lightning waiting to strike. Valeria remained in the doorway, her emerald dress a slash of color against the monochrome office. Her eyes took in every detail of the scene before her, Dakota's rain-dampened hair, the slight smudge of her lipstick on Maverick's collar, the intimate distance between them that spoke of reconciliation. "Don't let me interrupt," she said, her voice carrying that deadly calm that had always preceded their worst childhood storms. "I just came to deliver the Morgan acquisition papers, but clearly you're occupied." Dakota stepped away from Maverick but didn't retreat. She'd spent too many years backing down from her sister's quiet intensity. "Actually, your timing is perfect. We should all talk about this." "This?" Valeria's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "You mean how you've spent months destroying him, only to decide you want him back the moment someone else values him properly?" "Val," Maverick started, but she cut him off with a look that could freeze hell. "Don't." She moved further into the office, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. "Don't try to soften this. You've spent every night for the past 3 months in my bed, building something real from the ashes she created. And now what? One rain-soaked confession and you're ready to forget all that?" The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Dakota's hands clenched at her sides, her newly rekindled hope battling with the image of her sister and husband together. "I never meant to hurt either of you," Maverick said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of impossible choices. "Intentions mean nothing." Valeria's composure cracked slightly, revealing the depth of her pain. I watched you rebuild yourself piece by piece. I was there when you needed someone to believe in you, to see your potential without trying to control it. Where was she then? Learning from my mistakes, Dakota answered before Maverick could. Realizing that love isn't about molding someone into what you think they should be. It's about accepting all their versions, even the ones that scare you. How convenient that you've had this epiphany now. Valeria moved to the windows, her reflection overlaying the city lights. Now that he's successful, powerful, everything you said you wanted him to be. Tell me, sister, would you be here if he was still the comfortable banker you despised? The question struck home with surgical precision. Dakota felt Maverick tense beside her, knew he was wondering the same thing. I was wrong before, she said softly, addressing both of them. I didn't despise his comfort. I was afraid of it, afraid that he'd settled for less than he could be because of me, afraid that I'd somehow dimmed that fire I fell in love with. So you decided to burn everything down instead? Valeria turned back to face them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Do you have any idea what that did to him? I held him together when your words shattered him. I helped him channel that pain into something magnificent. And fell in love with him in the process? Dakota's voice was gentle, understanding in a way that seemed to hurt Valeria more than anger would have. Or were you already in love with him, Val? Since that first conference, before I ever walked into the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Maverick looked between the sisters, seeing for the first time the full complexity of what he'd stumbled into 8 years ago. Does it matter? Valeria asked finally. You got there first, like always, won the prize like always, even when you threw it away you still somehow managed to keep your claim on it. He's not a prize to be won, Dakota said, taking a step toward her sister. He's a man we both love, in different ways, at different times, and we're all responsible for this mess. Me for my careless words, you for waiting in the wings, him for seeking comfort in familiar patterns. Maverick moved to his desk, pouring 3 fingers of Macallan into heavy crystal tumblers. The familiar ritual felt absurd in the context, but somehow necessary. The truth is, he said, offering each sister a glass, I've been playing a part since that night. The comfortable banker, the ruthless empire builder. Both were masks, ways of being what someone else needed me to be. And who are you really? Valeria asked, her voice soft with vulnerability. Someone who's tired of choosing between versions of himself. He took a sip of scotch, letting the burn ground him. Someone who wants to build something real, not just out of spite or wounded pride. With her? The question carried 8 years of longing. With someone who sees all of me, the ambition and the comfort, the fire and the calm. His eyes met Dakota's, then moved to Valeria. The question is, which of you actually sees that? And which of you is in love with a version that doesn't really exist? The sisters stood in silence, each contemplating the truth in his words. Outside, the city was coming alive, the first commuters beginning their daily dance through the financial district that Maverick now commanded. I should go, Valeria said finally, setting her untouched scotch on his desk. The Morgan papers can wait until Monday. Val, wait! Dakota reached for her sister, but Valeria stepped back. Don't! Her voice cracked slightly. Don't try to fix this with sisterly understanding. Not now. Maybe not ever. She moved to the door with careful dignity, her posture rigid with control. At the threshold she paused, not turning around. You know what the worst part is. I actually thought this time would be different. That for once, just once, I might get to keep something you wanted. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the office. Dakota and Maverick stood in loaded silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy cloak. She's right, Dakota said finally, staring into her scotch. I do have a pattern of wanting things more when someone else values them. Is that what this is? Maverick asked quietly. Just another example of the pattern? No. She met his eyes, her own swimming with tears. This is me finally understanding what I had, what I threw away, and what it will take to rebuild it, if you'll let me try. He moved to the windows, watching the sun paint his empire in shades of gold. The comfortable banker and the ruthless titan had both been masks, but somewhere between those extremes lay the truth of who he was. We can't go back, he said, echoing his words from earlier. I know. She joined him at the window, their reflections overlapping in the glass. But maybe we can go forward. Older, wiser, better at loving each other's whole selves. And Valeria? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Dakota's heart ached for her sister, for the years of silent longing, for the brief taste of happiness now turning to ash. She needs time, she said softly. We all do. To heal, to forgive, to figure out who we really are when we're not playing roles for each other. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the city in morning light. Somewhere out there, Valeria was nursing a broken heart and shattered dreams. In this office, Dakota and Maverick stood on the precipice of something new. Not a return to what was, but a chance to build something stronger from the ashes of their mistakes. One day at a time, Maverick said, taking her hand. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever, just an acknowledgement that some things were worth rebuilding, no matter how complicated the process might be. They stood together as the city came alive below them, each lost in thoughts of what had been lost and what might still be saved. The game they'd all been playing had unraveled, leaving behind 3 hearts beating out of sync, 3 sets of dreams in various states of repair. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility, and somewhere in that future lay the hope that love, real, accepting, whole love, might be enough to heal the wounds they'd all inflicted on each other. The sun caught the crystal decanter, sending rainbow prisms dancing across the office walls. It was a new day in San Antonio, and with it came the chance to finally stop playing roles and start being real, with themselves, with each other, and with the complicated, messy, beautiful truth of who they all were. The unraveling was complete. Now came the harder part, weaving something new from the threads that remained. Chapter 11. Karma's Dance. The universe, Dakota was learning, had a peculiar sense of humor. As she sat in her office at Juniper Investment Group, watching the trading screens flash with alarming numbers, she couldn't help but appreciate the irony of her situation. 8 months ago, her careless words had pushed Maverick to build an empire. Now that empire was under siege, and she might be the only person who could save it. The hostile takeover attempt had been brewing for weeks, a consortium of old guard firms working in shadow to dismantle what Maverick had built. Leading the charge was Richard Montgomery, still smarting from Gideon Capital's aggressive acquisition of his family's firm. They're moving on the convertible bonds, her analyst reported, tablet in hand. 3 major holders have already committed to tender. If they get the rest, Maverick loses controlling interest. Dakota finished, her fingers drumming against her mahogany desk, the same desk where, just last week, she'd found the preliminary offer from Montgomery's group. They wanted her firm's backing in their takeover attempt. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd pushed Maverick to be greater, watched him build something magnificent from the ashes of their marriage, and now she held the power to either protect or destroy everything he'd created. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Chen, calling for the 3rd time today. She'd been avoiding him, knowing he was Maverick's proxy in this dance they were all performing. Dakota, his voice carried relief when she finally answered, we need to talk. About the takeover attempt. She kept her tone professional, though her heart was racing. Or about how your boss spent the last 3 months sleeping with my sister. Both. Neither. Marcus sighed. Look, you know what Montgomery's planning. You've seen the numbers. If they succeed, they'll break apart everything Maverick built, she finished. Sell it off piece by piece to the highest bidders. I know the play, Marcus. I've run the scenarios. Then you know we need your help. A pause. He needs your help, even if he's too proud to ask for it directly. Dakota moved to her window, looking out over the financial district. From here, she could see Gideon Capital's headquarters, its glass tower catching the afternoon sun like a beacon. Somewhere in that building, Maverick was fighting his own battles, perhaps wondering if she'd use this opportunity for final revenge. It's not that simple, she said, though her heart disagreed. When has anything involving you two ever been simple? The question hung between them, heavy with truth. Her other line blinked, Valeria, making her daily attempt at contact. Dakota let it go to voicemail, not ready for that particular conversation. I'll think about it, she told Marcus before ending the call. The sun was setting by the time she finally left her office, the city transforming into a constellation of lights and possibilities. Her driver took her not home, but to Rosella Coffee, where she and Maverick had first met at that startup conference years ago. He was already there, occupying their old corner table, 2 cups of coffee growing cold before him. The comfortable banker was gone, but so was some of the hard edge he'd developed in recent months. What remained was something in between, a man finally finding his true balance. Montgomery made you an offer, he said as she sat down. Not a question. 30% over market value for our holdings, she confirmed, plus a seat on the board of whatever emerges from the ashes of your empire. And I told them I'd think about it. She met his gaze steadily, just like I told Marcus I'd think about helping you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Holding all the cards this time? Karma's a funny thing, isn't it? She reached for one of the coffee cups, needing something to do with her hands. 8 months ago, I broke your heart with careless words. Now I hold the power to break everything else you've built. You think this is karma? I think it's the universe's idea of poetry. She took a sip of cold coffee, grimacing at the taste. The woman who pushed you to be greater now has to decide whether to protect or destroy what you've become. Maverick leaned back, studying her with those storm-grey eyes that had first captured her attention years ago. And what have I become, Dakota? The man you wanted, the titan you pushed me to be, or something else entirely? I think you're finally becoming yourself, she said softly. Not the comfortable banker, not the ruthless empire builder, just Maverick, the man who can bring me cold coffee and still make my heart race. Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability beneath the carefully maintained control. Montgomery will destroy everything I've built. No, she corrected gently. He'll destroy the empire you built from spite and wounded pride. But the real question is, what do you want to build now? Not as revenge, not as proof, but as yourself. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Outside, the city hummed with life, each light representing another player in the grand game they'd all been caught up in. I want to build something real, he said finally. Something that matters. Not just another financial empire built on aggressive takeovers and revenge plays. Then let me help you. She reached across the table, taking his hand. Not as the woman who broke your heart, not as a business ally, but as someone who finally understands what real partnership means. His fingers interlaced with hers, the gesture both familiar and new. And Valeria? She's my sister. Dakota's voice caught slightly. No matter what's happened, no matter what will happen, that doesn't change. We'll find our way back to each other eventually. But right now we have other battles to fight. he finished. They spent hours at that corner table, plotting strategy, reviewing numbers, finding ways to counter Montgomery's play without destroying everything in the process. It felt like old times, but better. No masks, no games, just two people finally working in true partnership. Dawn was breaking when they finally emerged, the city painting itself in new light. Dakota's phone buzzed again, Valeria still trying to reach her. This time, she saved the number instead of letting it go to voicemail. Some bridges would take longer to rebuild than others. "Ready for this?" Maverick asked as they stood on the sidewalk, watching the financial district come alive. "For helping you save your empire." She smiled slightly. "Or for figuring out who we are when we're not playing roles for each other?" "Both." She reached up, straightening his tie in a gesture that felt both intimate and professional. "I think we're finally ready to build something real together." The sun caught the glass towers around them, each one reflecting possibility rather than power. Somewhere in the city, Richard Montgomery was probably already at his desk, plotting the downfall of Gideon Capital, but he didn't understand what Dakota had finally learned. That true strength came not from destruction, but from the courage to rebuild something better from the ashes of past mistakes. Their car pulled up, ready to take them to their respective offices for what would be a decisive day in both their professional and personal lives. Before they separated, Maverick pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of cold coffee and new beginnings. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for saving your empire, for helping me find myself again." They parted ways, each heading to their own tower, but connected now by something stronger than business allegiances or marriage certificates. They'd finally found the balance between ambition and authenticity, between power and partnership. And as the sun rose fully over San Antonio, painting the financial district in shades of gold and promise, Dakota smiled to herself. Karma had brought them full circle, but this time they were ready to dance to a different tune, one of their own making. The real work was just beginning, saving Gideon Capital, rebuilding trust, healing family bonds. But for the first time since that fateful night 8 months ago, all of it felt possible. Because they'd finally learned the most important lesson. True power wasn't in building empires or winning games, but in being brave enough to be real with each other. Let Montgomery come with his hostile takeover. Let the old guard try to dismantle what Maverick had built. They were ready now, not just to fight, but to transform everything into something better, something real. Karma's dance had brought them here, but love would lead them forward. Chapter 12. The weight of regret snow in San Antonio was rare enough to feel magical, and on this December morning, fat flakes drifted past the windows of their favorite coffee shop on South Alamo Street. 1 year had passed since that fateful night when careless words had shattered everything, and now Maverick Gideon sat across from Dakota, watching her warm her hands around a ceramic mug of vanilla latte. The past year had transformed them all. Gideon Capital had survived Montgomery's takeover attempt, emerging stronger but different. Less an empire built on revenge, and more a legacy crafted with purpose. Dakota's firm had played a crucial role, not just in saving what Maverick had built, but in helping transform it into something meaningful. "Do you ever miss it?" Dakota asked softly, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the window. "The comfort we had before? The simplicity?" Maverick studied her face, noting how the snowlight softened her features, making her look more like the young woman he'd first met in this very cafe a decade ago. "I miss parts of it," he admitted. "But I don't miss the masks we wore, the roles we played." She nodded, understanding. They'd both lost themselves in those roles. He in comfortable complacency, she in perfectly curated control. It had taken destroying everything to find their way back to authenticity. I got a letter from Valeria yesterday, Dakota said, her voice catching slightly on her sister's name. She's coming home for Christmas. The weight of that statement hung between them. Valeria had spent the past 6 months in Europe, putting an ocean between herself and the complicated mess they'd all created. Her absence had been both a wound and a necessity, giving them all space to heal. "How do you feel about that?" Maverick asked carefully. Scared, hopeful, guilty. Dakota's laugh was soft and wet with unshed tears. "All of the above? She's my sister, Maverick, before anything else. Before you, before all of this. She was my sister." He reached across the table, taking her hand. His wedding ring caught the light, not the original platinum band, but a new one, chosen together when they decided to rebuild their marriage on honest foundations. "We all lost ourselves for a while there," he said gently. "You in your fear of settling, me in my need to prove something, Valeria in feelings she'd carried too long. The worst part is that I never stopped loving you," Dakota whispered, echoing words she'd spoken in his office months ago. "Not for a single moment, even when I was breaking everything with those stupid, careless words. Even when you were with her. Even when I thought I'd lost you forever." Outside, the snow fell harder, muffling the city sounds, until it felt like they were in their own private world. Through the window, they could see their old building where they'd first started their life together with nothing but dreams and a broken air conditioner. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night here?" Maverick asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "When I was nervous about pitching to those venture capitalists?" A real smile touched her lips. "I told you that you had fire in your eyes, and that's all that mattered. And now? Now I know it's not just about the fire." She squeezed his hand. "It's about balance, ambition and peace, drive and contentment, fire and calm. You taught me that this past year." A familiar figure appeared outside the window, hesitating in the swirling snow. Valeria, wrapped in an emerald coat, her early return from Europe clearly meant to be a surprise. She stood watching them through the glass, her expression a complex mix of love, pain, and hope. Dakota's breath caught, but she didn't let go of Maverick's hand. Instead, she raised her other arm, beckoning her sister inside. Because some things were stronger than betrayal, than rivalry, than past mistakes. Some bonds, like the one between sisters, could bend without breaking. Valeria entered in a swirl of snowflakes, bringing with her the sharp cold of December and the weight of everything they needed to heal. For a moment, the three of them simply looked at each other, acknowledging the wounds they'd inflicted and the bridges they needed to rebuild. "Hi," Valeria said softly, her voice carrying all the things they hadn't yet found words for. Dakota stood, releasing Maverick's hand, and crossed to her sister. The embrace, when it came, was both an ending and a beginning, an acknowledgement of pain and a promise of healing. "Welcome home," Dakota whispered into her sister's hair, feeling Valeria's tears dampen her shoulder. Maverick watched the sisters hold each other, understanding finally that love wasn't about possession or perfection. It was about acceptance of ourselves, of each other, of the messy, complicated truth of being human. They ended up sharing a table, the three of them, as the snow transformed San Antonio into something magical and new. There were hard conversations ahead, bridges to rebuild, trust to restore. But here in the coffee shop, where it had all begun, they found something they'd all been searching for. The courage to be real with each other. "We both lost ourselves," Maverick admitted, looking between the sisters who had shaped his journey. "You in your fear, me in my pride, and I in my silence," Valeria added softly. Dakota reached out, taking her sister's hand with her left, Maverick's with her right. A circuit completed, a circle of healing begun. "Maybe That's what this year has really been about, she said thoughtfully. Not just about losing ourselves, but about finding our way back to who we really are, to what really matters. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the familiar landscape of their city into something new and full of possibility. Inside, 3 hearts beat in rhythm for the first time in too long, each understanding that sometimes the greatest regret isn't the mistakes we make, but the time we waste not fixing them. They had all achieved the success they'd craved, built the empires they'd dreamed of, but sitting there, hands linked in healing and hope, they understood that ambition without love was like a sky without stars, vast but empty. "Come home," Dakota had whispered to Maverick months ago in his office. Now, as they sat together in the place where their story began, they realized that home wasn't a place at all. It was this: the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to forgive, the wisdom to love each other's whole selves, fire and calm alike. The snow fell softly outside, covering the city in a blanket of renewal. And in a coffee shop on South Alamo Street, 3 people who had lost and found themselves began the beautiful, difficult work of writing their next chapter together. Because sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one.